When wealth and love collide, the consequences can be unimaginable. Imagine a billionaire, known for his ruthless business empire, who decides to take the biggest gamble of his life, a wedding that promises to secure his future fortune. But little does he know, the stakes are much higher than he ever anticipated. What begins as a calculated move to expand his power takes an unexpected turn, and soon he's caught in a web of deceit, betrayal, and a price far steeper than he ever imagined. As the wedding day draws near, secrets that could unravel everything he's built start to surface. Will he emerge victorious, or will this wager be the one he can't win? Stay tuned, because the story is only just beginning, and the cost of winning could be more than anyone bargained for. The billionaire had always seen everything through the lens of profit and loss. Every decision was calculated, and every risk, no matter how enormous, was weighed against the potential reward. But as his wedding day approached, he realized that his usual tactics weren't enough. There were too many unknowns in the equation this time, and his soon-to-be wife, with her charm and elegance, hid a darkness that no one could have foreseen. The wedding, designed to unite two powerful families, was meant to be a mere formality, a business transaction masked as a romantic affair. But what he hadn't expected was the personal toll it would take on his soul, his relationships, and ultimately his empire. Tensions simmered beneath the surface, and with every passing day, the stakes rose higher. Family secrets, long buried, began to come to light. He thought he knew every corner of his fiancée's life, but what he uncovered shook him to his core. Her ties to enemies from his past were no coincidence, and the influence she wielded over him wasn't what it seemed. Was this wedding truly a strategic alliance, or was she orchestrating her own plan, one that could destroy him? With every moment that ticked closer to the big day, the billionaire's grip on his empire began to slip. He could feel the tension in his veins, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. He tried to ignore the whispers, the rumors, but they were growing louder. And then a message arrived, a warning he couldn't ignore. But was it too late to turn back? As the days leading up to the wedding ticked away, the billionaire found himself growing more restless, his thoughts clouded by the dark shadows that now loomed over what should have been a simple, grand event. The wedding, once just a way to cement his dominance in the business world, had become a trap, one of his own making. Each day brought new revelations, but the deeper he dug, the more tangled the web became, and every answer led to even more questions. The first bombshell had come from a source he thought was entirely trustworthy: his own family. His brother, whom he had always considered a loyal ally, had begun acting strangely. Subtle signs, an evasive glance here, a seemingly innocent conversation there, began to raise alarms. The billionaire had trusted his brother implicitly, but now the feeling of betrayal weighed heavily on him. Was it possible that his own flesh and blood had been working behind his back all along? What if his wedding was merely a pawn in a game too dangerous to understand? He confronted his brother one evening, after the last of the business meetings for the day had wrapped up. They met in the private study of his mansion, a room filled with books and rare artifacts, the atmosphere thick with tension. His brother, usually so calm and composed, was visibly shaken. But there was no denying the truth in the air. Something was off. The billionaire's sharp eyes locked onto his brother's, demanding an explanation. "I don't know what you're talking about, his brother stammered, his voice betraying the lie. Everything's fine. But it wasn't fine. Not by a long shot. The billionaire's gut twisted with the unease that had settled deep within him. His brother's attempt to brush him off only confirmed his suspicions. As the conversation ended, the billionaire couldn't shake them, feeling that he had just uncovered the first piece of a much larger puzzle. One that would ultimately change everything. Meanwhile, his fiancée, whose presence had once been a comfort, a beacon of grace, had become more distant with each passing day. It was as though she were a stranger, her smile now an enigma that hinted at something far darker than he could have ever anticipated. He had fallen for her beauty, her allure, but now he wondered if it had all been part of the act. Was she playing him? He had always been a man who prided himself on his ability to read people, but when it came to her, he was out of his depth. Late one night, he followed her, just a few steps behind, keeping to the shadows. He watched as she slipped out of their estate and into a sleek black car that sped off into the night. His heart raced as he watched the vehicle disappear into the distance. Where was she going? What could she be doing? And why hadn't she mentioned it? His mind raced through 100 possibilities, none of them comforting. Had she been hiding something from him all along? He couldn't ignore the creeping suspicion that she was hiding more than just a few secrets. Determined to uncover the truth, he hired a private investigator. What the investigator found was even more chilling than he could have imagined. It turned out that his fiancée had ties to some of his most dangerous enemies' rivals in the business world, the ones he thought he had neutralized years ago. It seemed that her past was far more tangled than he could have ever known, and it was becoming clearer that this wedding was far from a simple transaction. It was a calculated move, one that threatened to unravel everything he had worked so hard to build. But the deeper he went, the more dangerous the game became. The walls began to close in on him from all sides, and it wasn't just his fiancée or his brother who were playing a part in this. There were whispers of a much larger conspiracy, one that involved people he had trusted, people he thought were allies. His own empire was being targeted, and with each passing day, the cracks became more apparent. The very foundation of everything he had built seemed to be slipping through his fingers. Desperation set in as he realized how little control he actually had. No matter what he did, it seemed that forces beyond his comprehension were working against him. The wedding, once a symbol of power and success, now felt like a ticking time bomb. And as he lay awake at night, staring up at the ceiling, he could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. But it wasn't just the business that was at risk. The billionaire had always prided himself on being untouchable, on being the one who called the shots. Now, for the first time in his life, he was terrified. Not for his empire, not for the wealth that had always been his safety net, but for the one thing he hadn't considered, his own heart. He had always treated relationships as transactions, but now, the very woman he was about to marry was the greatest threat to his existence. He spent hours questioning himself. Had he misjudged her from the start? Was she playing him, or was he the one who had fallen into her trap? What was her true motivation? Was it love, or was it something far more sinister? His fears were realized the day the wedding invitations were sent out. In a small, carefully crafted note attached to the lavishly designed invitations, there was a cryptic message. The wager is almost over, and the price has yet to be paid. Your empire won't survive the storm that's coming." The billionaire's hands trembled as he read the words. His stomach churned, and his mind raced. He had never been one to be intimidated by threats. But this felt different. Was this just the beginning? The storm had arrived, and it was clear that the wedding was no longer just a symbol of wealth and power. It was the fuse to a much greater bomb. But what would be left standing when it all came to an end? The tension continued to build as the wedding day drew nearer. The billionaire felt cornered, trapped by his own choices. And as he stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tuxedo, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to snap. Would he survive this gamble? Or had he already lost everything? The final, most crucial decision of his life would come soon. But would it be too late to change the outcome? The answers seemed to elude him, and with each passing moment, the stakes only grew higher. But in the game he had chosen to play, there could be no turning back now. The billionaire stood before them. Mirror, the weight of his reflection heavier than ever. His face, once a symbol of confidence, now seemed distant, uncertain, haunted by the many decisions he had made, the paths he had walked down, and the ones he had avoided. His empire had been built on sharp calculations, on knowing when to strike, when to push forward, and when to retreat. But now, standing on the precipice of everything he had ever known, he realized that none of his strategies had prepared him for this. His eyes darted to the clock. The wedding was just hours away, but the storm, the one that had been gathering for weeks, was already here. The invitation, the ominous note, a reminder of the web he had willingly walked into, still burned in his hand. His mind raced, each second feeling like eternity. What had he missed? How had he allowed himself to be manipulated so thoroughly? In his pursuit of wealth and power, he had overlooked the most important thing of all, trust. And now, it seemed like every person in his life, his brother, his fiancé, even his closest advisors, had their own hidden agendas. He couldn't help but wonder if he had been so blinded by his own ambition that he failed to see the trap closing in around him. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the wedding had never been about love or power or even wealth. It had been about control. The fiancée, the woman he thought he knew, had always known that her power came from pulling them strings from behind the scenes. She had never intended to be a passive participant in his life. She had been the mastermind all along. And as much as he hated to admit it, the billionaire knew that he had walked straight into her game, believing that he was the one in control. He thought about his brother. Again. The way he had seemed uneasy when questioned. The way he avoided direct answers. Was his brother involved in all this? Or had he too been another pawn in a much larger scheme? The tension between them had only grown since that fateful conversation, the one that had left them both on edge, unable to trust the other. But no matter how much he wanted to believe in his family, the evidence was stacking up against them. The billionaire had always been a man of action, but now, for the first time in his life, he felt paralyzed. He had everything: a fortune, a legacy, a future that should have been guaranteed. Yet, it felt like it was slipping through his fingers like sand in the wind. Every time he tried to grip it, the harder it became to hold on. As he stared at his reflection, the door creaked open behind him. He turned to see his fiancée standing in the doorway, her eyes dark and unreadable. She had been the cause of his sleepless nights, the source of every doubt and fear. But now, as she stood there, he couldn't help but feel a strange calm wash over him. Perhaps it was the inevitable conclusion to all of this, the final piece of the puzzle, clicking into place. The time for questions was over. The time for answers had arrived. You know, don't you? She asked softly, her voice carrying a weight her had never heard before. You've figured it out. He didn't answer immediately, his mind working furiously to process the truth. I always knew something was off, he said finally, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. But I never thought it would be you. Her lips curled into a faint smile, one that held no warmth, only a sense of victory. You were never meant to win this game. None of you were. Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. But there was no surprise in his eyes, just a deep, painful understanding. He had been played, outmaneuvered, every step of the way. The billionaire's chest tightened as the reality of it all settled in. She wasn't just after his wealth. She had been after control, power, the very thing he had built his life around. The wedding was a pawn in her greater scheme, a stepping stone to a future he had no place in. And now, as he stood there, the empire he had spent his entire life building seemed like a hollow shell, destined to be taken from him without a second thought. But the billionaire wasn't the kind of man to go down without a fight. He had always known how to win, how to outsmart his opponents. Even if the game had changed, even if the rules had shifted, he refused to accept defeat. Not like this. Not now. His fiancée's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. But there was something else. There, something that made him pause. A flicker of doubt, maybe? Or was it fear? She seemed too calm, too confident, but there was a crack in her fade. Something that made him think that, perhaps, she wasn't as invincible as she believed. You've already lost, you know? She whispered, her voice low and dangerous. Everyone's in place. The wedding will go on as planned. And by the time it's over, there will be nothing left for you. Her words were like a knife in his chest, but he refused to let them break him. Instead, he focused on the one thing that still gave him hope, the power of information. No matter how far the trap had been set, he knew that knowledge was the key to unlocking it. If he could turn the tables, if he could expose the truth about her, about his brother, about everything, he might just have a chance to reclaim what was his. As he turned away, his mind working quickly, he felt the familiar fire of determination return. He wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. There was still one move left to make, one final card to play. And he would use it. The wedding day arrived, a spectacle of wealth and grandeur, the air thick with anticipation. But for the billionaire, it was nothing more than a ticking time bomb. Every detail had been meticulously planned, but it didn't matter. He was no longer the man in control. He had been replaced, displaced, by someone who had known how to play the game better than he ever could. And yet, despite everything, he felt a strange peace settle over him. The final act was upon him.